They told the city it was just a train line, a clean, modern promise of movement, progress, prosperity. But they never said it would become a financial sentence so heavy it would crush schools, hospitals, and entire neighborhoods for decades to come. One signature turned into billions in debt. One groundbreaking turned into generational punishment. And today, long after the ribbon was cut and the speeches were forgotten, the city is still paying for a project that quietly devoured its future. This is not just a story about concrete and steel. It's a story about how hope is sold, how numbers are hidden, and how public money is transformed into private fortune. It's the story of a city that believed it was building a lifeline, only to discover too late it had signed a contract with a financial machine that never stops feeding. We're going to follow the promises as they were sold, the numbers as they were twisted, and the power as it moved through rooms the public was never allowed to enter. And by the time this journey is over, the real question won't be how the project failed. The question will be who it was really built to serve. At first, it looked like salvation. A struggling city, boxed in by aging roads, collapsing infrastructure, and a shrinking tax base, was offered what sounded like a miracle. A state-of-the-art metro system that would connect workers to jobs, revive downtown corridors, attract investors, and pull the city into the modern economy. The presentations were flawless. The promises were bold. Politicians stood at podiums with glossy renderings behind them, speaking about opportunity, equity, and transformation. For many residents, especially those in neglected neighborhoods, it felt like someone had finally remembered them. It felt like progress had chosen them at last. But behind the speeches, behind the headlines, behind the carefully edited optimism, something else was being assembled very quietly. Contracts layered on top of contracts. Financing structures so complex they blurred the line between public service and private extraction. Debt instruments that didn't just fund a project, but locked an entire city into financial dependency. The numbers always sounded manageable when they were spoken aloud. Just a few dollars more in taxes, just a slight adjustment in budget priorities, just a temporary sacrifice for a permanent reward. And at each step, the public was told not to worry. Experts had it under control, the safeguards were in place, the growth would pay for everything. Then the costs began to grow, small at first, explained away as routine, unavoidable, the kind of adjustments that always happen in major infrastructure. A few million here, a delay there, new safety requirements, modified designs, supply chain issues. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own, but together they formed a pattern that only became visible when it was too late to stop. The original price tag was no longer recognizable. The debt was no longer theoretical, and the city had crossed a line where turning back meant financial collapse and moving forward meant surrendering to whatever the machine demanded next. This is where the story truly begins. Not with trains, but with paper. Not with commuters, but with contracts. Not with transportation, but with power. Because once the borrowing started, once the bonds were issued, once the guarantees were signed, the city stopped being a builder of infrastructure and became a supplier of guaranteed profit. Every year, money that should have gone to classrooms, emergency rooms, and public safety began flowing instead toward debt service, toward interest, toward penalty clauses, toward financial institutions that faced almost no risk at all. And the people felt it, slowly at first. A program cut here, a tax increase there, a delay in repairs, fewer teachers, longer emergency response times. Entire communities asked to accept less because they were told the city had obligations it could not escape, obligations it barely understood when it agreed to them. What was once marketed as an engine of growth became an anchor, dragging every part of civic life downward under its weight. What makes the story even darker is that none of it happened in chaos. It happened in order, through votes that were scheduled, through hearings that few attended, through reports written in language that discouraged questions rather than invited them. Oversight existed on paper. Accountability was promised in public. But in the shadows between those two things, a very different reality took shape. One where cost overruns became profit opportunities, where delays became leverage, where political careers became intertwined with financial performance, and where the worst possible outcome for the city became the most reliable outcome for those positioned to collect. Tonight, we rewind the story to the very beginning, to the first promise, the first warning that went unheard, the first deal that quietly shifted risk off powerful institutions and onto ordinary people who would spend the rest of their lives paying for a decision they never truly got to make. Because this is not just the story of a metro. This is the story of how a city's future was converted into a revenue stream. And once that process begins, it doesn't need trains to keep running. It only needs debt. The city didn't wake up one morning demanding a metro. The idea was planted gently, wrapped in language that made opposition feel selfish and doubt feel ignorant. It arrived as a vision, carefully polished and emotionally engineered. Leaders spoke of connectivity as if it were destiny. They spoke of growth as if it were guaranteed. They spoke of transformation as if steel rails alone could rewrite history. And for a city exhausted by traffic, declining industry, and neighborhoods left behind, the promise sounded like rescue. They showed maps first, long sweeping lines cutting through forgotten districts, linking working-class neighborhoods to economic opportunity. Then came the numbers everyone wanted to hear. Tens of thousands of jobs. A flood of private investment, property values rising, poverty easing. The metro wasn't just transportation, they said. It was justice on tracks. It was equality powered by electricity. It was the future, arriving right on time. Public meetings were filled with applause and cautious hope. Community leaders echoed the same message they had been given. This would be different. This wouldn't be another broken promise. This project had partners, experts, global consultants, financial architects, the best in the world. People were told that smart cities invest in transit and smart cities prosper. To resist was to choose stagnation. To question was to stand in the way of progress. And what the public didn't see was how carefully the narrative was managed. Early internal projections were softened before they went public. Risk was reframed as ambition. Worst-case scenarios were buried under best-case renderings. The media ran the headlines they were fed. Historic investment, once-in-a-generation opportunity, a new economic lifeline. And every headline pushed the city a little closer to a point of no return. For families struggling to make rent, the promise of construction jobs meant food on the table. For small business owners, the promise of new foot traffic meant survival. For young people, the promise of mobility meant escape. Hope spread faster than any rail ever could, and that hope became the shield that protected the project from early scrutiny. Because once people emotionally invest in a future, they become reluctant to question the cost of reaching it. The politicians stood at the center of it all, framed as visionaries. They spoke and rehearsed certainty. They talked about legacy, about doing what past generations were too afraid to do. They spoke of courage while avoiding the one question that mattered most: who would pay and for how long? Behind the scenes, consultants were already billing, law firms were already drafting. Financial institutions were already modeling cash flows not from ridership, but from interest. The machine was warming up long before the first shovel hit the ground, but none of that made it into the speeches. The public was given the dream, not the invoice. By the time skepticism began to surface, it was framed as obstruction, as negativity, as resistance to change. And by the time the city realized the dream had conditions attached, it was already too emotionally committed to walk away. The promise had done its job. It had opened the door. And once that door opened, the future would walk through it, whether the city was ready or not. The first real warning didn't arrive with sirens or protests. It arrived quietly, in spreadsheets and footnotes, buried inside early budget drafts that almost no one outside a few offices ever truly examined. On the surface, the number still looked impressive, but manageable. Big projects cost big money. Everyone understood that. What most people didn't understand was how fast that number was already drifting away from reality. Inside closed meetings, analysts were flagging gaps between what politicians were promising and what engineers were estimating. Land acquisition alone was coming in higher than expected. Utility relocation was proving far more complex than the glossy presentation suggested. Environmental compliance was triggering delays that translated directly into cost. But instead of slowing down, instead of reassessing, the response was acceleration. The logic was simple and dangerous. If we move fast enough, the resistance can't organize. The budget that went to public vote was framed as conservative, responsible, carefully planned. It wasn't. It was a strategic understatement, designed not to reflect the true cost of the project, but to clear the psychological barrier of approval. Because once the city said yes to the first number, it would be far easier to justify every increase that followed. This wasn't budgeting. This was bait. Concerns were raised in council chambers, often by the same few voices that rarely made headlines. They asked about overruns, about contingency funds, about what would happen if ridership projections fell short. They asked who exactly would be responsible if the numbers exploded. And almost every time they were answered with the same calm reassurance. The project was sound, the models were solid, the risk was minimal. And besides, backing out now would send the wrong message to investors. Pressure did the rest. Political pressure, business pressure, media pressure. No elected official wanted to be labeled as the one who killed the city's future. No council member wanted to face campaign ads accusing them of destroying jobs. So the vote moved forward under the weight of urgency. This is our moment, they said. If we miss it, we fall behind forever. And so the budget passed. What the city approved that day wasn't just funding, it was permission. Permission for borrowing at a scale most residents had never experienced. Permission for contracts that would be renegotiated again and again. Permission for a financial structure so complex that even many officials wouldn't fully understand it until the consequences arrived. The public thought they had approved a project. What they had really approved was a process. Almost immediately, small adjustments began appearing, nothing alarming on its own. A revision here, a supplemental allocation there. All framed as responsible responses to new information. But the truth was already taking shape beneath the surface. The original number had never been meant to hold, it had only been meant to pass. From that moment forward, every step became harder to reverse. Every new dollar committed made the last decision feel justified. And slowly, without a single dramatic collapse, the city crossed a dangerous threshold. It moved from choosing a project to protecting an investment at any cost. The moment the city stopped paying with cash and started paying with promises, everything changed. Bonds sounded harmless to the public, almost abstract. They were described as tools, not burdens, as smart financing, not long-term surrender. Officials explained that the market's appetite for municipal debt was a sign of confidence. Investors believed in the city's future, they said, and belief, they implied, was as good as money. What most residents never truly heard was the other side of that statement. Those investors weren't betting on prosperity. They were betting on obligation, on guarantees written into law, on tax streams that could not disappear, on penalty clauses that could not be negotiated away. The city wasn't offering profit through success. It was offering profit through certainty. The first major bond issuance was celebrated. It was framed as momentum, proof that the project was now unstoppable. Money flowed in quickly, more quickly than any accountability ever could. And with every dollar borrowed, interest quietly attached itself like a shadow that would follow the city for decades. Not just repayment, servicing, refinancing. Fees layered on top of fees. Whole industries that exist solely to ensure that borrowed money never truly leaves the system. The structure was elegant in its design and brutal in its impact. Short-term construction needs were funded with long-term debt. Political leaders got immediate achievements. Lenders got generational returns. And the risk was redistributed downward, away from institutions that could absorb it and onto taxpayers who could not. People who had never purchased stocks, never issued bonds, never voted on financial derivatives were now underwriting a complex debt portfolio with their daily lives. Inside the financing agreements were clauses most citizens would never see, and few officials would publicly explain. If revenues fell short, the city would still pay. If economic conditions worsened, the city would still pay. If costs ballooned beyond projections, the city would still pay. Failure did not dissolve the obligation. Failure accelerated it. And still, the narrative remained optimistic. The city was told that ridership would explode, that development would cluster around stations, that tax revenue would surge, that the metro would pay for itself. It was all framed as inevitability. Growth wasn't a possibility, it was a promise. And promises are powerful enough to silence fear, even when fear is justified. With every new bond sale, the project became less like infrastructure and more like a financial engine that demanded constant fueling. New debts were used to manage old ones. Refinancing became routine, not as relief, but as extension. The timeline stretched quietly from years into decades, and without a single public declaration, the city's future income had been partially pre-sold to satisfy obligations made long before many residents were even old enough to vote. This was the moment the project stopped being about transportation. This was the moment it became about entrapment. Because once debt is structured to survive every possible failure, the only thing left that can truly fail is the city itself. For a short while, it looked like the worst fears might not come true. Construction began with ceremony and cameras, hard hats, ribbon cuttings, smiling officials standing in freshly dug earth. Crews moved in, fences went up, streets were torn open. The city watched the future being carved into the ground, and for a brief moment, belief returned. Then the first overrun appeared. It was explained calmly, almost casually, an unexpected soil condition, a deeper bedrock than anticipated. A few additional millions to reinforce the tunnel. No one panicked. This was normal, they said. Large projects always face surprises. The revised figure barely registered against the total. Then came the next one, and the next. Design changes introduced after construction had already started. Environmental mitigation that should have been planned from day one. Utility lines that hadn't been fully mapped. Each problem brought a new invoice. Each invoice arrived with language carefully chosen to make it sound temporary. Inevitable, technical, nothing that should worry the public. But the pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to look. The metro was no longer merely expensive, it was becoming unpredictable. Forecasts were rewritten not because conditions improved, but because previous ceilings had already been shattered. The original budget became a reference point only in the way a starting line is remembered long after the race is lost. Contractors, protected by clauses buried deep inside legal language, renegotiated with leverage. Delays meant penalties paid by the city. Accelerations meant bonuses paid by the city. Even mistakes often translated into billable revisions. The risk followed the public money. The rewards followed the private signatures. Officials stood before microphones insisting nothing was out of control. They spoke of transparency while shielding the most critical details behind technical committees and redacted reports. They spoke of accountability while delaying independent audits that might expose how fragile the project had already become. Each new estimate was framed as the final correction. Each time, it wasn't. Behind closed doors, pressure intensified. Walking away now would be catastrophic, they said. Too much money already spent. Too much reputation already invested. Too many contractors already entrenched. The trap tightened not through force, but through fear. Fear of embarrassment, fear of legal battles, fear of being remembered as the ones who let it all collapse. For citizens, the numbers became absurdly large, then strangely numb. A few million became tens of millions, tens became hundreds. Hundreds crept toward the unimaginable, and somewhere in that climb, the project crossed another invisible threshold. It stopped being measured against public benefit and started being measured against financial survival. The city was no longer building a metro, it was chasing a runaway cost explosion with borrowed money and fading credibility. And the only certainty that remained was this: every delay made someone richer, every change order fed the machine. And the deeper the project sank into overruns, the harder it became to admit what it had turned into. By the time the cost overruns became impossible to ignore, the project had already grown roots deep inside the city's power structure. What began as a transportation plan had evolved into a network of political favors, lobbying pressure, and protected relationships. The metro wasn't just concrete anymore, it was influence. Construction firms that had secured early contracts expanded their footprint, subcontracts multiplied. Consulting groups rewritten entire oversight frameworks. And nearly all of it happened with the quiet blessing of officials who now depended on the same players they were supposed to regulate. Oversight bodies still existed in name, but their teeth had been filed down by exemptions, special authorities, and emergency powers justified in the name of keeping the project on schedule. Lobbyists filled the spaces between government offices and corporate boardrooms. They spoke the language of urgency and complexity. Regulators were told the project was too big to slow, too interconnected to disrupt, too important to risk with aggressive scrutiny. And slowly, accountability began to dissolve into coordination. Political campaigns felt the gravity shift as well. Donations flowed from industries now deeply exposed to the project's success. Transportation interests, infrastructure financiers, engineering conglomerates, it was all perfectly legal, it was all properly disclosed. And it all quietly rewired the incentives of those in office. The metro was no longer something to be questioned, it was something to be protected. Whispers of conflict of interest surfaced from time to time. A council member whose spouse worked for a contractor, a senior official who later accepted a private sector role, a committee chair who blocked audit requests while receiving industry funding. None of it alone was enough to spark outrage. Together, it formed a picture no one wanted to hang on the wall. Dissent grew riskier. Officials who pushed too hard found themselves isolated. Committees were reshuffled. Reports were delayed. Budgets were debated behind technical language that discouraged public engagement. What sounded like governance was functioning more like insulation. And the public, once invited in with grand promises, now found the doors quietly closing. Meetings became shorter. Documents became harder to interpret. Questions were redirected or answered with abstractions. The language of progress replaced the language of proof. Trust was expected, not earned. This was the point where the project crossed another line. It was no longer just financially protected, it was politically armored. And when a project becomes too entangled with power to be criticized, it stops being a public service, it becomes a political asset. Something to be defended, not evaluated. The metro now lived inside a web of relationships where failure was no longer an option for those at the top. Not because failure would hurt the city, but because it would expose how deeply connected personal survival had become to the project's continuation. And once that bond was formed, the interests of citizens and the interests of power were no longer the same thing. The first cuts didn't feel like warnings. They were framed as adjustments, a revised library schedule, a delayed school renovation, a hiring freeze that was described as temporary. Most people barely noticed at first. Cities change all the time, officials said. Budgets shift. Priorities evolve. But beneath those small distortions, something far heavier was beginning to press down. As debt service climbed, it began overtaking core public spending. The bills from the metro arrived whether the city's revenues grew or not. Interest didn't care about economic downturns. Penalty clauses did not pause for political transitions. The debt demanded to be fed on schedule. Every schedule, without exception. Sales taxes were adjusted slightly. Individually, each increase looked tolerable. Together, they formed a silent extraction that millions of residents felt in their groceries, their rent, their power bills. And still, the explanation never changed. The city had obligations. Schools began to feel it next. Class sizes crept upward. Support staff positions vanished. Programs that once protected vulnerable students became line items under review. Parents were told to be patient, to understand the broader picture, to accept that sacrifice was part of transformation. But the transformation they were promised no longer felt like it belonged to them. Hospitals and emergency services followed, equipment upgrades postponed, response times stretched, overtime budgets tightened. The same city that had found limitless money for tunneling now struggled to fund the systems that kept people alive. And in the neighborhoods that were once showcased as beneficiaries of the metro, the betrayal cut deepest. Displacement accelerated as speculation followed construction. Rents surged near future stations while wages lagged behind. Longtime residents watched revitalization price them out of the very communities they were told the metro was built to save. Psychologically, the shift was devastating. The project that began as a promise of dignity turned into a reminder of powerlessness. People stopped asking when the benefits would arrive and started asking how much worse it could get. The language of public debate changed from expansion to survival. What hurt most was the realization that none of this was happening because the city had collapsed. It was happening because the city was still paying, faithfully, relentlessly. Every dollar diverted toward debt was a dollar not spent on people. Every year the payments grew. The public life that supported families grew smaller. The metro had been sold as a bridge to the future. But now, for millions of ordinary residents, that future felt further away than ever, and the cruelest truth began to settle in. The city wasn't shrinking because it failed to grow. It was shrinking because it could no longer afford its own promises. By the time city leaders admitted the debt had become structural, not temporary, the escape routes had already vanished. What was once described as a flexible financing plan had hardened into a long-term obligation wrapped in penalties, covenants, and conditions that made renegotiation feel like financial suicide. The city wasn't just in debt anymore, it was confined by it. Refinancing was introduced as relief, a way to reset payments, to stabilize the budget. But each restructuring only extended the clock while thickening the chains. Lower payments today meant higher totals tomorrow. Short-term breathing room created long-term suffocation. And every reset was paired with new fees, new advisors, new guarantees that further protected lenders while deepening the city's exposure. Credit ratings became weapons. Any hint of default risk triggered threats of downgrade, higher interest, lost investor confidence. Rising borrowing costs across the entire government. The message was clear without ever being spoken aloud. Pay on time, or everything else becomes more expensive. The metro debt didn't just control the transit system, it began controlling the city's financial destiny. New administrations came in promising reform, promising transparency, promising to get a handle on the situation. But they inherited a structure designed to resist reform. Contracts signed years earlier outweighed campaign pledges made yesterday. Bond covenants written by legal specialists outweighed the will of voters. The future had already been partially sold, and it didn't come with a refund clause. Each budget cycle became an exercise in managed decline. What else could be cut to preserve compliance with debt terms? Which services could be reduced without triggering political revolt? How far could the public be pushed before anger outweighed obligation? The city learned to live inside a narrow corridor where survival meant obedience to financial structure rather than responsiveness to human need. Generational consequences became impossible to ignore. Children born after construction began were now entering schools that still carried the burden of a project approved before they were alive. Young adults were inheriting tax structures shaped by decisions they had never voted on. Even future growth was pre-committed, already spoken for by schedules written decades earlier. This is where the illusion of time shattered. The metro was no longer framed as something that would eventually pay off. It was now openly acknowledged as something that would be managed indefinitely. The city hadn't borrowed against tomorrow. It had mortgaged multiple tomorrows at once. And through it all, the payments never missed a beat. They were automatic, impersonal, unforgiving. The debt didn't care about elections. It didn't care about recessions. It didn't care about pandemics or disasters or population loss. It existed on its own schedule, demanding tribute long after the speeches that justified it had faded into archives. The city had not just built a transit system, it had built a financial cage. And every year that passed proved just how difficult it is to tell the difference between stability and entrapment. The truth didn't arrive with a confession. It arrived in fragments, in scanned documents uploaded long after public interest had faded, in footnotes traced by journalists who refused to stop asking why the numbers never made sense, in contract language so dense it seemed deliberately engineered to exhaust anyone who tried to follow it all the way through. Buried inside those papers were guarantees the public had never been told about. Revenue protections that activated when projections failed, insurance mechanisms that compensated investors if the city stumbled, clauses that shifted loss automatically, invisibly, away from financial institutions and directly onto public funds. The metro hadn't just been financed, it had been fortified. Some contracts promised minimum returns regardless of performance. If ridership fell short, the city would make up the difference. If revenues dipped, taxes would be adjusted. If the economy slowed, penalties would trigger. The lenders weren't exposed to uncertainty. They were insulated from it. Risk was treated like a contaminant to be sealed off and handed downstream. Then came the discovery of layered protection, derivatives quietly attached to bond packages. Interest rate swap agreements that turned out to be catastrophically one-sided. When rates moved in the wrong direction, the city paid extra. When rates moved in the right direction, the upside flowed elsewhere. It was financial gravity, always pulling in the same direction. Even termination was engineered against the public. Attempts to unwind certain contracts carried exit penalties so extreme they made escape mathematically pointless. The longer the city stayed in, the more expensive leaving became. The trap didn't snap shut all at once, it tightened in stages. What shocked investigators most wasn't just the brutality of the structure, it was how early it had been designed that way. These protections existed from the very first financing rounds. They weren't emergency measures added during crisis. They were foundational, built in before the public ever voted on the project, built in before the first promise was ever sold. And suddenly the narrative collapsed. The overruns weren't chaotic, the delays weren't random, the refinancing cycles weren't mismanagement. They were features of a system that didn't rely on the metro's success to generate profit. It relied on permanence, on financial obligation that could survive anything. The paper trail revealed something chilling. The project could stall and still produce income. It could underperform and still generate returns. It could become politically toxic and still drain public wealth on schedule. The only outcome that threatened the structure was full exposure. This is what the city was never meant to see, not just a failing project, but a financial architecture where success and failure both pointed to the same destination: public payment, private security, permanent debt. Once the documents were laid side by side, the pattern became impossible to unsee. What looked for years like a series of unfortunate mistakes now aligned with disturbing precision: the early underestimations, the rushed approvals, the aggressive borrowing, the protective clauses, the refinancing cycles, the overruns that never seemed to threaten the people who benefited most. None of it lived in isolation anymore. It formed a system. At the center of that system was a simple rule: the public would absorb uncertainty, private institutions would absorb certainty. No matter how the project performed, no matter how the economy shifted, no matter who won elections, the flow of money would remain stable in one direction: out of the city, into financial structures built to endure political chaos and public suffering alike. Every stage now made sense in a way that felt almost unbearable. The low initial budget wasn't faulty math, it was psychological entry pricing. The speed of approval wasn't efficiency, it was insulation against scrutiny. The cost explosions weren't disasters, they were leverage. The political protection wasn't coincidence, it was necessity. Each layer supported the next. Each failure fed the same engine. What made this system so powerful was not secrecy alone, it was normalization. Each stage felt just routine enough, just technical enough, just distant enough from daily life to avoid triggering revolt. People felt the pain of taxes and service cuts, but they rarely saw the machinery that required those sacrifices. And when they did, it was described in language so abstract it drained the anger right out of the truth. By now, the metro no longer needed defenders in office to survive. Its design did that automatically. The contracts enforced behavior. The bond markets enforced discipline. The ratings agencies enforced obedience. Power no longer had to argue. It only had to calculate. For the city, this was the most devastating realization of all. The project had outgrown human decision-making. It no longer depended on vision, leadership, or even competence. It ran on obligation alone. A self-sustaining debt organism that converted future public life into guaranteed financial yield. And once you see that, you begin to recognize it elsewhere, in highways that never stop costing more, in stadiums that never seem to pay off, in revitalization projects that leave entire communities poorer than before. Different structures, same logic. Risk flows downward, profit flows upward. The public carries uncertainty, power carries insurance. This was never just a metro story. It was a blueprint, one that doesn't need corruption in the crude sense to function. It only needs silence, complexity, and the unspoken agreement that some losses are acceptable, as long as they don't happen at the top. By the time the city understood the system it had entered, it was already playing by rules it never helped write. And the final, cruel truth settled in with undeniable clarity. The project hadn't gone wrong. It had gone exactly as designed. The final truth wasn't revealed in a courtroom. It wasn't announced in a scandal. It didn't arrive with handcuffs or resignations. It emerged quietly, mathematically, when all the layers were finally pulled together and the full structure stood exposed without disguise. The city did not just build a metro. It built a permanent debt engine. Every stage of the project, from the very first approval to the latest refinancing, was aligned toward one outcome that never changed: continuous payment, guaranteed extraction, risk without consequence for those positioned at the top. The rail system was only the justification. The real product was obligation. Once the full financial architecture was visible, everything snapped into focus. The low starting budget wasn't optimism, it was the entry fee. The overruns weren't disasters, they were accelerants. The refinancing cycles weren't rescue, they were extensions of profit. The penalty clauses weren't safeguards, they were enforcement tools. No matter what happened, the city would pay. If ridership soared, the lenders collected. If ridership failed, the city compensated them. If the economy grew, tax revenues were redirected. If the economy collapsed, the payments still came due. There was no scenario in which the public did not lose. This wasn't mismanagement spiraling out of control. This was a structure that converted uncertainty into guaranteed return. A structure where success and failure both led to the same destination. Public money transferred outward on schedule, decade after decade. The most devastating realization was this: the metro never had to succeed as a transportation system to succeed as a financial one. It only had to exist. It only had to remain unfinished in some ways, delayed in others, constantly improving, constantly adjusting, constantly justifying new financing, new bonds, new restructures. Completion wasn't the objective, continuity was. The debt was not a side effect, it was the core feature. And suddenly the city's slow collapse made horrifying sense: the shrinking services, the rising taxes, the hollowed-out schools, the exhausted hospitals, the communities pushed to the edge. None of it was accidental. It was the downstream cost of feeding a machine that had been designed to be fed forever. This is the moment where the story stops being about a single city. Because this structure didn't arise from local incompetence alone, it followed national templates, international frameworks, financial models deployed again and again wherever public desperation meets private capital, different facades, same machinery, infrastructure framed as salvation, debt engineered as destiny. The city believed it was buying a future. What it actually signed was a contract to supply it. A contract written in bond covenants instead of ballots, enforced by credit ratings instead of law enforcement, and immune to outrage because its power doesn't depend on approval, it depends on arithmetic. This is the final truth everything led to. The metro didn't bury the city in debt by mistake. The debt is what the metro was built for. What began as a promise of movement became a story of containment. A project sold as public good transformed into a private financial fortress, protected by contracts few citizens ever saw and consequences few decision-makers ever faced. The city believed it was investing in opportunity. What it actually invested in was obligation that could not be voted away, paused, or forgiven. This is how modern public collapse often looks. Not with explosions or sudden ruin, but with spreadsheets, refinancing schedules, and quiet deductions from the future. It happens through language that sounds responsible and systems that feel too complex to challenge. It happens when risk is described as shared, but only one side is shielded from loss. The tragedy is not only financial, it is trust. Trust between citizens and institutions. Trust between communities and the leaders who spoke in their name. Trust in the idea that public projects exist to serve the public, not to feed mechanisms that thrive regardless of human cost. This story is not meant to make people cynical. It is meant to make them alert. Because once you understand that debt can be engineered to outlive truth, outrage, and even failure, you begin to see how easily a future can be sold one necessary compromise at a time. And once that pattern is learned, it becomes impossible to unlearn. In the end, there was no single villain to arrest, no final hearing that set things right, just a city still paying, still adjusting, still sacrificing pieces of itself to satisfy a structure it never fully saw being built. The trains kept moving, the payments kept coming, and the future that was promised arrived carrying a very different weight than anyone had been told to expect. If this story opened your eyes, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can see how these systems really work. Tell us in the comments which part of this story shocked you the most, or if you see the same patterns unfolding in your own city. And stay connected to Corruption Rewind because more deep investigations into money, power, and public betrayal are coming next.